morning to you all. We just read those words from Hosea, and the ones that struck me were that we may live before him. And actually that's probably what we're about. We want to live before him. You may have noticed quite a lot of disruption on the roads today. Transport changed. About a special day, about remembrance. And today I'm going to think about remembrance. Remembrance in two ways. To start off with, we're all different. Each one of us is different. If you take the words in Corinthians, we're not all hands, we're not all noses, we're all different. And we like what we like. We watch what we watch, we enjoy what we enjoy. And our minds can be fairly close to that sort of thing, what we like. And yet there is strength in diversity. There are different approaches, and maybe one's no better than the other, but they're good for each one of us. Now last week we had an exhortation which was about Hezekiah. It was all about good work. Some of us felt a bit dismal at the end because we just didn't live up to those standards. We just weren't there. Some felt it was a really good exhortation, some felt it was a bit too works. We're different people. We heard about Hezekiah that the work he began, he ended. He set things in order, they weren't just random. The daily things were done. He prepared himself daily. He did it with a sense of urgency. He emptied himself of bad things and filled himself up with good things. And that was quite a challenge, very difficult for us. And so the message each week is different. It was works last week for me. Sometimes we have grace, sometimes we have love, sometimes we have a character study, but today it's going to be about remembrance and it's going to be about joy. Trying to reconcile these two ideas. Perhaps through memory, through gratitude, through respect, through appreciation, through love. Now my crossword a couple of weeks ago said positively charged, 6 letters. You've got to try and work out what that is, but my aim is to send you away as anodes, positively charged. You might notice as you look through the hymn book, some of them come under the heading Comforts of the Truth. And quite often they drop you down to cheer you up. Sometimes we don't like to be dropped down to be cheered up, but sometimes it's necessary. So what though the night is black with storm, though the night be dark around us, though our pilgrimage be dreary, you know, we don't always have to be brought down to this level. Sometimes we can try and have a bit of joy without the down first. And we're going to, as I say, try and explore remembrance and joy. Remembrance, very topical. Now, as a boy, I remember Poppy Day at school. They told me it was about soldiers who gave their lives, and they were making and selling poppies to finance themselves. And as I got older, the concept of remembrance became less popular, until the Falklands War. And I think that probably was a bit of a turning point, where all of a sudden, war was back on the agenda. And we heard a lot about a guy called Simon Weston who burnt himself badly, or was burnt badly. And then more recently we have had 9/11 and all the subsequent military activity that's taken place. And if you go to Selly Oak, which I'm sure Claire's been to, you'll see the effects of war. You see these pathetic lakes that lots of people seem to be walking around on. It's not very nice. It makes you remember. It's 100 years ago this year since the start of the Great War. And the Tower of London has got this exhibition on, Blood-Sweat Lands and Seas of Red. Now, 4 million visitors have been there a week ago. It's a very big event. People have remembered. Tower Hill Station was closed because there were just too many people trying to get there. There are 888,246 poppies there to remember the fallen servicemen. So whether we like it or not, this week is a week of remembrance. And even in our local paper, you know, the Solihull Rag, that's not what they call it, but there we are. You can't get away from remembrance of these poppies. Even in our local newspaper, there they are. So, this week is about remembrance in the UK. There's sadness and loss about people we will never know. There's celebrating and learning about events we have only ever been told about. And we express our thanks for peace and joy. And actually, I've known nothing else in my life. Now, remembrance is a cycle. You don't know about something until you're told about it or experience it. And then it can lose its relevance. And it only comes back to be pertinent and important when you're reminded. And then things can come flooding back. Now, we were in Scarborough last week, and the first town to be bombed by the Germans on the 16th of December 1914 was Scarborough, and 18 people died, and it became the subject of a military recruitment campaign. All that detail's in my mind now because I was there last week, but I'll soon forget. But there's a museum, there's memorabilia that will help me remember. Now, my father told me that everything stopped at 11 o'clock on the 11th day of the 11th month. The trams would stop, because he was into trams, and people would just stop and think. And I remember what he said. You know, it was very important to him and the people at that time in history. They lived through the war. It was harsh, it was cruel. Their house was actually firebombed, and a firebomb went through the roof down into the garage. My father worked in the marshes in Kent, and it was cold and it was damp, and it was very unpleasant. So for him, when the war finished, it was a very, very good thing to remember. So we remember it, but perhaps we never experienced it. And this remembrance isn't without controversy. Jonathan Jones in The Guardian wrote that it's deeply disturbing that 100 years on, we can only mark this terrible day as a national tragedy. The crowds come to remember, but we should not just be remembering our own. We should be remembering other people who died, and that didn't go down in some quarters. So today, people are happy to remember. But what do they remember? Those who gave their lives, whether they were injured or psychologically damaged. Maybe they think about the need of war or the futility of it. Maybe the hardship of that age. But we know that war is not a place that many would choose to take their loved ones. And God is characterized by peace, we read in Corinthians. It's slightly out of context, but that's what we're saying. Now, we are reading the Acts of the Apostles in the readings, and it would be good to look at some of the things which are said there. I want to take our minds to Jesus and all that means to us. As I said earlier, peace is something I have experienced all my life. I take it for granted. But actually it's a true blessing. And as we read through Acts, we read about things that we have never experienced, we have never seen, we were not there. But we remember them. We remember the beautiful things of Acts, of Pentecost, the arrival of the Holy Spirit, the baptisms, the healing, the holding things in common. Many beautiful things happened in the Acts of the Apostles, but many horrible things happened too. There were disagreements, there were riots, there were arrests, there were trials, there was prison, there was stoning, there were all sorts of horrible things. And remembering is important, because if we remember, it drives our thoughts and it drives our actions. And remembering is very big in the Bible. ask a question, see if you're listening. How many times do you think remembering or remembrance or that sort of thing comes up in the Bible?
Ooh, 150 times?
Higher.
2,000.
I don't know the answer, but I've got... well, the word comes up in different ways, doesn't it? It can be remembrance, remembering, and all sorts of different ways of coining it. But it's at least 200, so 150 was a pretty good guess. It's big. So we remember days. You know, within Exodus, there are all sorts of days that had to be remembered. Coming out of Egypt with joy. The feasts. Again, they came out of Egypt and they remembered that with joy. The tabernacles, they remembered it with joy. When they crossed the waters, the river, the stones, 12 stones were erected. And that was so as they remembered with joy how God had looked after them. The laws were very special to them. And others commented on how good these laws were. They had to remember them. And they used to have a little blue tassel. I haven't got one on my garments, but they had a blue tassel so as they remembered the law. It was about remembering. They remembered that possessions that they were given were provided by God. And we think around the things that we should be remembering. The stories that are passed down, and in particular the bread and the wine, which we can see under the cloth here. Shall I just move that?
Yes.
Yeah, that helps us remember. But we actually remember, or we come together to remember Jesus. That's why we're here. Some very well-known words I'm going to read you from 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians 11 verse 23. You know them, probably most of you can recite them, but it's actually why we're here, so it's worth remembering. For I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way also, he took the cup after supper, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." What does proclaim the Lord's death mean? If you go to one or two other versions, it helps because it says in slightly different ways. One says to remember affectionately. Another version talks about drawing you back to this meal. And of course, when we remember Jesus, it means something different to everybody in this room because we're all different. We're not all noses, we're not all hands, we're different. But for whatever reason, this remembrance is about joy. We meet here together to support each other, to remember Jesus, and there should be happy times, and there should be about optimism. We should be experiencing some calm and some peace and joy. And most of you probably remember Peggy Greenwood. She's in Hereford these days, but 30 years ago or something like that, she exhorted our CYC, and when asked what advice she would give to the young people, she said, "Stop and smell the roses." She said, "Stop and smell the roses." That's actually what we would call me time, but it's not really me time in this today, that it's me reflection time. It's not going off on some exciting adventure. It's stopping, reflecting and remembering. And that's what Peggy said 30 years ago. And actually that's what it says in Hosea as well. So that's why we had Hosea read. Hosea chapter 6 and verse 6. "I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." I want you to remember. I want you to bring to mind. I want you to remove from forgotten to remember. So it's all about a positive experience. And then again, if we go back to the Acts of Apostles and see what's written there, it gives us context. It reminds us how all the things that are so important to us today got started. Paul tells us lots of different things in Acts. We find out about the bright light that told him he was to stop persecuting the Christians and in fact to become one, and that Ananias had been told that he was to go and find Paul, and that Paul, however unlikely it would be, was a chosen instrument of Jesus's. Then we have the story about the Gentiles being brought into the church. Again, how unlikely, but it was true. And then we had the baptism of the Holy Spirit. How unlikely, it was true. And then all the things that Paul would have to go through, and that Jesus was there to encourage him day by day. How unlikely, but true. So those things that happened to Paul were relevant because he told them to other people. He reminded himself these experiences were important to him. It would have been easy to forget, but he remembered. Paul told his hearers so that they knew and they remembered. And Luke wrote those down for his readers because he thought they were important too. And most of us think they're important to us and relevant today. So we remember the words today that the Gentiles were being brought into the church and that Jesus is with us today and every day. In Hosea chapter 6, I think it's the message that says, I am after love that lasts, not more religion. So we've been brought into the church to remember. The Jews corrupted their religion. It tells us in Hosea 9 and verse 9 that they have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah. And we see the crime of Gibeah as awful, as heinous, beyond human possibilities, really. And yet it's not. We know how low people can sink in the wrong circumstances and when they forget. So we proclaim the Lord's death. We remember affectionately. We've been drawn back to that meal where Jesus desired with desire to be with his friends. It was very important. It was a meal of love. It was a meal of joy. I guess we purpose in our heart that we live before him. And yet in Hosea chapter 6 and verse 4 we find that our love is like the morning cloud, like the dew that goes away early. Your declaration of love lasts no longer than the morning mist. How easy it is for us to be distracted. Probably we don't intend to be distracted, but we can be. And so our purpose today is to remember. That's what we've come to do. Quite often we cloud what we hear about with all sorts of other things, but actually it's to remember Jesus. It tells us again in the Message version in Hosea, I want you to know God. So now, quite unashamedly, I'm going to try and get you to smell the roses, as Peggy said to us 30 years ago, to the CYC people anyway, to stop and think. Now, what is the first thing that you can remember? Ideally the first nice thing you can remember. You don't have to tell me. You see, I can remember, or I think I can, I don't know whether I can or whether it's just an imagination. Paul might be able to help me. But I can remember running along our hallway in Linton Road, the house we first lived in, and sliding, and just enjoying running along and sliding on the lino. And it was fun. And that's, in my mind, is one of the earliest things, and it's a nice thing to remember. So another memory for you. What's the first act of kindness or generosity that in your mind? Something happened to you when probably you were very young. Again, I can recall a kind person. It involves sweets, and I guess normally it does when you're young. And you've got a warm feeling about that particular person, because it was a guy called John Page, and he spent 15 shillings Now that was an awful lot of money. It was £0.75 at that point, on sweets. For us, we met him in the village in Dayton Boys. He took us to the sweet shop and he said 15 shillings. And I remember that. And loved the guy till he died. So, what sort of memories have you got about nice people and making you feel good? You don't have to tell me. But now, I'd like to move that memory to what we're here to do. We're here to remember Jesus. What was the first time when you really felt that Jesus was part of your life? Possibly it was around baptism. It might have been before. It might have been after. Relive that moment. Think about it. The feelings, the emotions. Okay, now you're beginning to warm up. How about the last time that you felt Jesus was powerfully acting in your lives? Maybe it was a decision time. Maybe it was a time of hardship. Maybe it was a time of joy. I don't know. Relive that moment. The feelings, the emotions. And the last one is, when was the last time you felt that Jesus was impacting your life? So I watched a brother last week. We had a receiving in, and it's a brother who we don't see that often. He had tears in his eyes as he watched his daughter being received in. We can all have an impact. So relive that moment. Relive the feelings and emotions that you've had. And so now we come to the bread and the wine. We're not actually thinking about the bread and thinking about the wine. We're thinking about Jesus. They're a way to remember Jesus. And what about that cycle we talked about earlier? You don't know something until you're told it or you experience it. And then you can forget things quite easily. And it's only by remembering that these things are brought back. So we've experienced God and Jesus directly in our lives. I've got no doubt about that. We've tried to reignite that awareness this morning about those things that we might have forgotten, times past, maybe many years ago. But now we remember Jesus. Long ago, in 700 BC or something like that, we thought about the people who forgot and remembered. We've come more closely to the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago when he walked the earth. We've thought about yesterday for us. But we also think about today, because actually today is pretty important. And we ponder the possible tomorrows. So, this is not about bread and wine. This is about Jesus. The bread and the wine help us remember. And so with joy we proclaim the Lord's death. We remember affectionately. We remember the message of Jesus to us. We remember his example. We remember his compassion. We remember some of the things that happened when he walked the earth. We remember Paul's message about Gentiles, us, being brought into the church, and that Jesus is with us today as he was with Paul. So now we will share the bread and the wine together. We will do it with joy as a church. But individually, you and me, as all of us, we will individually consider what it means to us.